Jonathan. Well, welcome to the Oregon Transportation Commission Annual Workshop. I'd like to thank everyone for making time to be here with us today. It's a great opportunity for us to come together and really learn about some of the new technology. It's I think, a little bit of a step two for us. As many of you may know, we had an opportunity to meet with our counterparts in California and Washington. They hosted us in California. We had an opportunity with the Tri-State Commissions to learn about new technology coming online, things that we, policy implications, safety implications, urban, rural, what does it mean in terms of our decisions that we're making. And so this is an opportunity for us to come together and learn about what's happening, and I'd like to welcome my commission members as well. And at this point, I think I'll go ahead and turn it over to Jerry Bohard, who's going to walk us through today's agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, commissioners. For the record, my name is Jerry Bohard. I'm the Transportation Development Division Administrator. And what I'd like to do is have the folks sitting around the table take a moment to introduce themselves. Jean is going to walk through the agenda. And then I have some opening remarks, and then Adam will start the presentation and then turn it over to the consultants. So with that, Kristen, please.
Hi, I'm Kristen Hull. I work at Jacobs Engineering, and I am our West Region Transportation Planning Leader, and I'm here to talk with you about emerging technologies and the policy implications.
Hi, my name is Brian Burkhardt. I'm the Global Technology Leader of Advanced Mobility Systems at Jacobs Engineering, and I'm here to talk about some of the emerging technologies in transportation.
Hi all, I'm Adam Argo. I'm the Principal Planner with ODOT's Transportation Planning Unit.
And Jean.
And I'm Jean Lawson with JLA Public Involvement. Nice to see you all. And I'll be facilitating the workshop today.
And I'm not sure that we have your microphone on.
Oh, I turned it on, it went off. I think the battery went. Can you hear me now?
It's okay, we'll take a quick pause. I'm not sure that we will be able to hear you, so.
Okay, can you hear me? Oh, no, it goes right back off. So I think it's, I will grab one of these other mics.
Yeah.
You can actually use one of ours if you like. Well, I was going to say, I can probably use Matt's here for a second. So just to, now I know you can hear me. So just to reiterate, the purpose of the agenda today is really to make sure we all have a common understanding of emerging technologies and how they're changing how we think about it, thinking about how it can relate to the work of the Oregon Transportation Commission and ODOT in a number of ways, the implications in terms of policy and workforce, et cetera. Defining the Commission's core questions, we really want to leave today with an understanding of what you've identified as the key issues and questions you'd like to have identified, and advise ODOT staff on what needs to happen as we move forward. So we'll end the session today with a specific conversation about next steps. So in terms of agenda, how that will work is Brian, who you met, will talk about the emerging technologies, present some, and we want to have enough time for everyone to basically get a clearer understanding of those technologies. There's not enough time for us to really, I will tell you, because they're fascinating. We could spend the entire afternoon talking about emerging technologies, what they are, but we want to start with a discussion and an understanding of what they are. Then Kristen's really going to focus on what the implications, some of the key implications that are understood or questions about those, really relate it back to a lot of the goals and policies of ODOT today. I do want to say now, and we'll say it again later, she has a great tool to show this, and we don't need to debate the tool. It's not science. It will be something that will help the discussion. So again, something that should help that discussion, and then we're going to be digging in, working on identifying your issues, your questions, and understanding what's most immediate, what's most important, and can have the greatest impact. So with that,
It's mine.
yes.
Yeah, so to say, I just have a few opening remarks. I'm going to turn it over to Adam, and then we're really going to go down the line with the presentation. So I know as commissioners, there are many aspects that you need to think about as items are brought to your attention, and emerging technologies is no different. You'll hear from Adam. The paper that we've commissioned was to really set the framework for the future policy discussion as staff starts working on identifying what needs to be included and addressed, whether we're updating the Oregon Transportation Plan or the Oregon Highway Plan. But that's not the question before us today, but rather this is a beginning dialogue on technologies that are disruptive, that change our way of developing plans and policies, in large part due to the uncertainty as to the impact of these technologies, the timing, and how they might impact other things, so that domino effect. Also note that the presentation really emphasizes what will happen in the planning horizon of around 2040. So not necessarily the full deployment of all these technologies. That said, while I might have the luxury of thinking about 20 years plus, I recognize that you have decisions based on a 2-year budget or a 4-year STIP. So don't hesitate to ask questions as you think about those timelines as well. And again, while this really impacts my direct responsibilities in working on development of policies and plans, these technologies will likely impact how we function as an organization, what our workforce might look like, and ultimately affect the future of the transportation system. So as you think about these other legs of the school, you should be thinking about that as you go through this presentation, as you go through the facilitation. Don't hesitate to ask those questions, thinking about that as well. So while the information presented to you begins to shape the policy discussion, we recognize, again, sort of the impact it will have to our agency and to our organization. And I think that really becomes important as we work through with Gene. Also, as you think about some of the aspects of House Bill 2017 and the management review, there are numerous connections to this ongoing work. My involvement with CIAC has been pretty limited to date, but certainly technologies is one way that allows us as an agency to become more efficient. And there will be opportunities, I think, for us to think about that from a continuous improvement standpoint and really help us as an agency to become more nimble and adaptable as we learn about these technologies. The other is around the strategic business plan with connections to some of those focus areas. So I am helping to lead the optimize and modernizing of technology and data. And while that work is really a lot about some of the day-to-day technology needs, it really is also about preparing for the future, especially as we think about the data that may come from connected and automated vehicles. And a lot of that obviously will be private, but that information can really help us think about what we can learn about the transportation system and how it functions. When you think about building a qualified and diverse workforce, we're thinking about our workforce today and what it looks like in the future. So what will those skills need to be as we think about how the organization changes in the future? And your strategic decision making, right? I think as we learn more about technologies, it's going to affect how you think about some of our future financial decisions. So just to be clear, this presentation is in no way is going to answer those questions. Sorry about that. But this is really just the first phase of the discussion, the building of understanding. There are many unknowns and uncertainties which you're going to hear about this afternoon, and the goal is really to just start us on that path of figuring out our next steps. This uncertainty will certainly challenge our future decisions and our timing of decisions, so I think that balance in your role as decision makers will be one of the challenges as you go through this conversation. You are going to hear Kristen talk about a potential tool that I think will help us to bring some understandings as we work through that. And also the agency has been doing stuff, and I think Adam's going to talk about this a little bit, but the AV task force, right? So what have we been doing as a state? I do have, I think Tom stepped back a little bit, but Tom's here, so if we have any questions about the task force, Tom will be there to answer any of the questions. Certainly we have staff from our Office of Innovation, and they've been very engaged in the whole connected and automated discussion. I think you're going to hear about something that Galen is doing during your business meeting. So you're going to see that the agency has been thinking about this, and now we're really bringing sort of forward that concerted effort as we talk to our decision makers. So with that, I'll turn it over to Adam to begin the presentation.
Thank you, Jerry. Good afternoon, Commissioners. It's great to be with you today. I wanted to provide some background context for today's workshop in relation to ODOT's current and projected work addressing emerging transportation technologies. I'm the project manager for the Emerging Technologies Impact Assessment. Yes, from here on, I'm going to use the acronym because that's a handful or mouthful to say. And the project explores key trends in emerging transportation technologies and implications of the trends at a qualitative level as viewed through a state of Oregon perspective. And so the graphic here depicts the timeline and key milestones of the ETIA. You will see the workshop there, and then the report, which we will begin drafting, actually following the workshop. In early 2019, we'll have the draft and final report. The ETIA is led by Transportation Development Division, TDD, in the planning section, but with close coordination with the Office of Innovation. The project was first identified as a task within the work program of the Connected Vehicle Automated Vehicle Steering Team, which is an internal agency group I'll touch upon shortly. Just to show and get to this graphic, the ETIA report is going to feature an executive summary as a standalone document, and the report considers a range of possible impacts. It looks out to year 2040, 2045, and accounts for uncertainty. And Brian and Kristen are going to, in their presentation, give you that kind of framework. We all have to try to put ourselves in looking ahead to that kind of horizon. The final report concludes phase 1 of the ETIA project, and the outcomes of phase 1 inform phase 2. Now, phase 2 of the project, which will be about probably 8 months in duration, beginning early next year, is a more quantitative type analysis aspect of the project. It involves development of an analysis framework. It utilizes the process of scenario planning to explore a broader range of considerations in preparation of updates to the Oregon Transportation Plan and potentially the Oregon Highway Plan. Now, I want to acknowledge the critical role that the Connected Vehicle and Automated Vehicle Steering Team has had in directing the work plan that includes the ETIA project as a primary task. The purpose of the, and I'll use the acronym CAV, steering team, is to lead the agency in implementing ODOT's transportation vision as it relates to connected vehicles and automated vehicles. The CAV steering team is responsible for keeping up to date with developments in the field of connected vehicle and automated vehicles and preparing the agency on critical CAV investment decisions. But I will note the ETIA actually expands a bit beyond just connected and automated vehicles, as you're going to hear Brian and Kristen talk about and address. So to further touch upon what Jerry said, in addition to being a key ETIA project deliverable, today's workshop is an entry point for OTC engagement with TDD to inform next steps of the ETIA project in the sequence of events that will lead to planning policy updates. I look forward to working with you, my ODOT colleagues as well, and our partner agencies as we look ahead with ODOT's mission and values as our marker to a future that encompasses both uncertainty and great transformational potential. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Brian Burkhardt with our consultant team on the project from Jacobs to start the talk about the overview of technologies and trends.
Thanks, Adam. Can you hear me okay? Good. Thank you, Commissioners. Thanks, everyone, for having us. So I'm a technical person, and this is something I get very passionate about. And so having the opportunity to talk about what is in my world is very exciting. And I'm going to walk through this, and please, at the end, feel free to ask any questions that you might have to further explain any of this. So the process that we went through here, part of our team, we have a group of experts that have been working in this field for a long time in transportation technologies. But we've also did a recent literature review, and this is something that we have to keep track of literally every day. Just as by way of example, the US DOT put out guidance on October 4th, just 2 weeks ago, updating the automated vehicle recommendations. So this literally is something that we have to keep track of every day. We also had interviews with many experts in the field worldwide, and that helped inform understanding the direction of some of these technologies and really trying to separate some of the hype from reality too. So the three areas that we're going to capture are vehicles, mobility options, and freight. And to start off with, let's get into some of the vehicles. Connected vehicles is an area that I've been fortunate to have worked in for the past 14 years. So connected vehicles is the ability for vehicles through radio communication be able to communicate with other vehicles and with roadside. We call that V2V or V2X. And this is very prevalent. It's been a part of the US DOT's initiative through the Joint Program Office as a research effort. And there are many pilots going on across the country testing out how these vehicles actually can be utilized. The benefits to the agencies are tremendous. Not only is there an opportunity, as Jerry mentioned, to grab data from these vehicles, but just as importantly, push data out to these vehicles. So we're familiar with the dynamic message signs that are on the side of the road, electronic signs. Think of that virtually in the car, getting advanced information on traffic incidents, road weather information. The opportunities are just tremendous. Now, as far as what's happening in the industry, there's two main areas that I want to touch on that are very significant, especially this year. One is the difference between two major types of technologies. One is called DSRC, that's Dedicated Short-Range Communications Radio, and the other one we refer to as CV2X, which is Cellular Vehicle to Everything. And DSRC, back towards the end of the Obama administration, a notice of federal rulemaking came out that put into motion that all new vehicles by 2023 would need to have some type of communications enabled to allow vehicle-to-vehicle communications. And this also allowed what we call the heartbeat of this type of vehicle, called the basic safety message. So the vehicles emit this message basically saying, here I am. And that sort of set into motion this idea of getting this type of technology into vehicles. And many thought that DSRC would be that type of technology. Well, 5G has really come to the fore now. Companies like Qualcomm have created the new types of chips that are rolling out at the end of this year. And 5G is an opportunity for cellular technologies to actually do what we thought DSRC could do. And there's a bit of debate as to what, think of it as the VHS versus Betamax situation. So that is very much happening right now. It's talked about quite a bit in the industry. Another area, too, that involves the FCC is the 5.9 gigahertz spectrum. And it's a valuable spectrum. It's sort of the sweet spot for radio. And many are wanting that space. Now, the feds had sat on that frequency for a long time, and private industry has really been trying to fight for use of that. So there's a lot of talk about shared spectrum use. So that is very much in the media right now. Now, you'll see that this is a graph that shows the GAO's assessment of the trajectory of the connected vehicle program. And there's two caveats there, both of which I just mentioned. One being the final rule on the rulemaking for that would mandate vehicles to have this type of radio, and then also the FCC's final decision on spectrum use. And there's no dates for that yet. So again, those are areas that are a bit gray, but we're right about here right now. And there are three main pilots going on across the US that are taking the US DOT's initiative in this research to the next step. Automated vehicles. I've been working in connected vehicles for 15 years, and we didn't really hear anything about automated vehicles until Google started driving their vehicles down where I live in the Bay Area. And so it's in the midst. It's something that we hear about every week in media. And one of the areas I just want to try to touch on here, this is the Society of Automotive Engineers, a classification of the 6 different tiers of automation. All of us have something along the lines of level 1 and level 2 automation in our vehicles right now. What we really are interested in is when we start being able to take our hands off the wheel, what we call level 4 or level 5 automation. And that's what everyone is kind of talking about when we have interest in on how those vehicles will impact society and mobility. And this is an interesting graphic because what we're showing here is this is from the media right now and from some of the manufacturers that have said we're going to have a level 4 vehicle to market by X date. And Tesla did say the end of this year, so that didn't necessarily happen. So on one end of the spectrum, we have very aggressive ideas about getting these types of vehicles to market. On the other end, we have a little bit more conservative, like Honda, who is anticipating, yeah, we can make level 4, but we still have a bit more to test. We still have a bit more to look at before we roll that out to market. I would say probably the sweet spot that makes the most sense, outside of any regulations that are required, our vehicles will start becoming more readily available for level 4 introduction around 2020, early 2020s. Adam mentioned CAV, Connected Autonomous Vehicles, and that's with the advent of automated vehicles, we now really kind of conflate those two together. Dr. Steve Schlottover from PATH is quoted as saying, an automated vehicle is only as good as it is connected. And I think that there's a lot of people that understand the value of being able to have that extra capability of communicating because it allows you some situational awareness that goes beyond the immediate sensing capabilities of an autonomous vehicle. So you'll hear connected autonomous vehicles referred together as CAV, just for terminology's sake. Now, there are some manufacturers, such as Tesla, that are adamant on saying that their vehicles do not necessarily need to be connected to anyone else. They can drive autonomously. So moving to electric vehicles, one of the things that we are seeing with electric vehicles is out here in Oregon is consortiums behind getting these vehicles into market. There's initiatives such as the West Coast Electric Highway that is looking at getting electric vehicles into public adoption. And this particular interest is to help get away from what we call range or charge anxiety, which is a detraction from the purchase of electric vehicles. So this initiative is looking at getting ways of getting the electric vehicle charging capabilities onto our highways. Another example is the multi-state zero emissions vehicles action plan. And this has an aggressive goal of 3.3 million zero-emission vehicles by 2025. Oregon is a part of this consortium. And really, this is focusing a lot on outreach to public and also to informing dealers as well on getting these electric vehicles into market, as well as infrastructure, policies, and standards. Moving from vehicles to mobility options here. This is probably an area that touches most of us more readily right now. And the examples of these are transportation network companies such as Lyft and Uber, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but also car, bike, scooter share, microtransit when we talk about first and last mile, and then we'll talk about mobility as a service, or MaaS. So mobility options. The mobility TNCs have been in Oregon now since about 2014. And just to give you a magnitude of how much this has changed, we looked at there's a 37% increase in usage from 2016 to 2017. It's tremendous. It's at a rate that never was anticipated. And one of the things that is really impactful is that it's projected that nationwide TNC usage will surpass transit vehicle usage by the end of this year, which is tremendous. Now, one of the things that TNCs are looked at is a transition to autonomous vehicle usage. And it's no surprise that both Uber and Lyft are in the autonomous vehicle market Obviously, their greatest costs are the overhead of drivers, aside from the discussion of workforce impacts there. This is a private interest that they're looking at and evaluating the capabilities of these vehicles to drive by themselves. Now, Waymo, on the other hand, is entirely autonomous. There is a Waymo autonomous taxi fleet that has been deployed in Frisco, Texas this year as one of the first massive pilots that is looking at vehicles with absolutely no drivers at all. And this is just regular vehicles with autonomous technologies placed inside. In the work that I've been doing in AV and connected autonomous vehicles, one of the areas that I see the most with our clients across the country is this area. And what we have here is a spectrum of a bit pipe dream and kind of crazy thought to reality. Over here, where this is the VW Cetric, and it's a concept essentially. In the middle there, we have the Toyota e-Palette, and on the right here is shared autonomous shuttles. And this is probably the most common question that I get asked is, hey, can we try these out? What do we need to do to bring these into our community? This is probably the biggest area of interest. Local Motors happens to be one of those companies. They're a company out of Phoenix, and this particular model is 3D printed. So we're talking about tremendous capabilities of literally on-demand manufacturing. One of the things that these types of vehicles offer is the ability to move to a flexible route or on-demand. And that's something that is really sought after by some of the people that are implementing these type of solutions. The price for these, from public cost perspective, is a lower travel price than what it would cost to take Uber or Lyft. We're seeing this as really another transition to autonomous vehicle usage. Car sharing. There's about 20 car shares that are operating now in the U.S. The 90% of them are with these three manufacturers right here. And it's a crowded market, but most of the car sharing activities do occur in urban areas. This represents also a shift in attitude that we're seeing that does have impacts into these new technologies. And that is that people are more interested in buying rides than vehicles. And that's something that is impacting things like this. Now, another thing to think about from an agency perspective is that in this particular instance, some locals are mandating that data from these entities are shared, and this is very helpful in planning and understanding origin-destination trips. Bike share and scooter share. This arrived in about 2010. It was year over last was a 25% increase. And the large push this last summer was with scooter share. I have to smile because it is kind of a contentious issue, particularly where I'm from in San Francisco, where you cannot walk on the sidewalk without nearly getting killed by one of these vehicles. So it's a little scary. So yeah, I think it's interesting. It's a conversation that we as mobility planners need to understand is when these technologies are that impactful where we're looking at safety. It's a real concern. Now, what's great about these options here is that there is an open standard for this. It's the General Bike Share Feed Specification. And this allows an opportunity when the agreements are made with some of these entities to grab that data and further understand origin-destination trips and help to get some refined understanding of how people are moving. And then finally, mobility as a service, another acronym for you to know, MAAS. And you might be more familiar with this from using a Google app. In some local entities, you're able to, when you pull up your Google app and getting a trip, you're given many options, many mobility options, whether that be bike, TNC, or transit. or personal vehicle use. Now, some areas that we've seen that are fairly innovative is looking at gamification. So, for example, in some local entities, MPOs are interested in promoting the reduction in greenhouse gases. So there has been some concepts and pilots that have been out there to allow travelers to choose their greenest route and earn points as a means of competitive nature. And this is something that some of our younger generation folks can get into. Another example of a mobility as a service app would be the TriMet's Open Trip Planner, which is the Shared Use Mobility FTA project. Now, freight is another area that outside of the shared autonomous vehicles, an area that I definitely have seen a lot of activity in. The freight practice, the logistics practice has changed quite a bit. Whereas before we would have a lot of warehousing of goods, we were looking at more on-demand and responsive delivery, and drones are part of this actually. So, but if you think of vehicles that are traveling and roaming in urban areas, ready to deliver, this is a sense how companies like Amazon are making it available to bring up your coffee filters to you that afternoon. Now, this is really impacting the industry tremendously. In the work that we're doing with some of the ports, we're hearing from some of the trucker community that there's a severe driver shortage. So I think this is possibly an area where necessity is the mother of invention, where I think the freight industry is looking at automation as a means to help deliver on the demand that is happening right now. And then as far as some areas that we're seeing freight take on some of these newer technologies, one is using platooning. And there's a few pilots across the country. There's a private company called Peloton that has put forth technology that, in a sense, has a lead vehicle that is a master and following vehicles that are slave. And this master-slave communication will help control all of the vehicles behind it and allow these vehicles to travel at much closer distances than previously anticipated. And what happens is that not only do the vehicles following receive fuel savings, but the vehicle in front will actually receive fuel savings here too. Now, in order to implement some of this, some of the things that we took for granted, such as local laws that require certain following distances on vehicles, these would have to be looked at and reconsidered as exemptions to that to allow these type of vehicles to be piloted in some states. So what does this all mean? So we now have a tremendous amount of data. And the data is great because it can help agencies on decision making and on planning. But there's also real-time capabilities now that have never heretofore been able to realize. We're talking about real-time capabilities of getting real-time incident information, real-time traffic information that we just haven't been able to get. It also does have impact on how DOTs are structured. So similar to this predecessor, which I see as intelligent transportation systems is suggested to DOTs, maybe we need to start bringing information technology professionals into what we're doing. So you see IT departments being integrated into DOTs. So I think that this is also maybe an opportunity for agencies to consider people like data scientists to be part of this process, because we're talking about petabytes of data available right now. And so I do see this as an opportunity for DOTs to consider purchasing possibly data, in some instances where it's proprietary, but hopefully getting into partnerships that will allow this data to be utilized and to help inform planning and also to get understandings on incidents. Other considerations that I think that in the near term, we're going to see mobility benefits first. So as far as safety benefits as impacted by this, yes, definitely. This is why we want to remove humans from vehicles, because we cause a lot of accidents. 90% of all vehicular deaths, 95 around that area, are caused by us, not by our vehicle. So this is the impetus behind getting these new types of vehicles into our midst. The challenge is going to be is that in-between time, when we have both legacy vehicles and new vehicles. And that is where, that's the biggest challenge, is being able to allow our roadways to have both these types of vehicles in our midst, and that's the biggest challenge. So, these trends will, have implications to ODOT's planning, policy, and investment decisions. And that's what we're going to get into when I move it over to Kristen. But before I do that, I'm available for any questions and curiosities about any of this technology.
And I know we're getting short on time in this section, but I think it's good to make sure you understand it. Brian's going to be here throughout the discussion, so there'll be a lot more time later for this. But any clarifying questions before we move on?
I guess my first question is, who are the leaders on this? Which jurisdictions, which states, which countries, which cities are moving on this?
Yeah,
and so we don't need to invent all this.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, you're right. Some states have been leads in this. Michigan comes to mind. And it's my first connected vehicle project happened in Michigan, and that was about 15 years ago. The AV guidance that came out, the USDOT guidance, has a map and illustrates all of the connected vehicle projects that are going on across the state. Certainly, California is up there, Florida, and New York. And what we're seeing is, if I can't leave out Nevada as well. Nevada developed a AV and connected vehicle framework policy that addressed the climate exactly the way that Oregon is here. So I think that's probably the closest corollary to the state.
And internationally, I'll just say that I was reading something this week that, and this is not really on specifically what you've been presenting, but that over the last 3 years, Vienna has improved its, in terms of modal share, its transit share has gone from 27% to 38% of ridership. By comparison, TriMet in the Portland metro area is at 4.
Yeah, I would say that so Japan and China have really jumped ahead on bringing connected vehicle technologies to the fore. UK is just starting to come to the table. In fact, I'm going there in a couple weeks to talk with Transport Scotland, because they have just developed a connected autonomous vehicle program, so they're kind of just jumping onto that now. And Australia is a bit there too, but not so much. I think it has a lot to do with whether or not a country is a manufacturer of vehicles. So Australia isn't really a manufacturer of vehicles, whereas all the other ones I mentioned are big manufacturers. So that has big impact.
I was curious about what you've learned or have seen about how these new concepts and ideals play a role in rural communities. Obviously, these are all urban, densified communities in which you're talking about an interface where there's connected and autonomous robots all communicating with one another. But how does that connect into the rural communities?
Yeah, the rural communities. That's the tough question to answer. I would say that that when we're talking about autonomous vehicles, autonomous vehicles allow a previously underserved members of our society, whether that be the elderly or disabled, to have access to travel that they may not have had before. And so I think that's probably the best way that I could answer that. I don't know if long trips would necessarily be served by connected or autonomous vehicles, in as much as one of the things that it would do is allow that commute to be a little bit more convenient. So if people are living at sort of the edge of a commute, whether that be an hour and a half, 2 hours away, now they can travel and do work at the same time. Whereas before you'd have to concentrate on driving. So we're now looking at maybe shifting that time that you would be spending concentrating on driving now. So I think probably the best way to answer that is we might see possibly more urban sprawl or movement into areas that were not previously lived in.
And then you mentioned at the beginning, I believe, it's funny you were going on that route because my brain automatically went to this whole conversation around gigahertz. Mm-hmm. And at some point, there's a threshold before it becomes hazardous to human health. Mm-hmm. What is that threshold and how does that tie into this conversation, given the private sector's push on wanting to gain more gigahertz to broaden their reach to employ more technology? As far as radio technology is concerned, I know that there has been some public concern about 5G. If that's what you're referring to as far as electromagnetic? Yeah. Way higher. Yeah, so when we're talking about the frequencies that we're talking about, they're in our midst already. So it's 5.9 gigahertz is a very commonly used frequency range, similar to Wi-Fi. So we have 2.4 and then 5.8. So the FCC does have control over those emissions and regulates the power that those can transmit at, keeping public safety at a concern for sure.
Okay.
So one more, and I know you're watching the time, so this will be my last one this round. So,
great.
So related to what you were talking about are other aspects of planning. This strikes me as a complex planning environment because the environment is moving as we're planning for it, and we don't know where it's going exactly. And so there's a lot of anticipatory thinking going on in this.
Absolutely.
But related to everything you've been presenting, I increasingly wonder about what the workforce mobility patterns are going to be 10, 20, 30, 40 years out. I see this already in my law firm where everyone used to come every day, 8 to whenever we finished, and then we would get back there the next morning, or 7 until, whenever we went home. And if you weren't there, by 7:05, people were saying, where's Bob? Like you dropped off the earth. Now, increasing percentage of our people, both lawyers and staff, are working at home regularly, and that trend is going to continue, I think. So part of where I'm going is, who are the leaders in terms of thought, leading us through a thought exercise on how this, all of what's going on here relates to how people actually want to move around for work and otherwise. Because they should connect if we're planning correctly, or hopefully are getting somewhere in the same neighborhood. So if nobody works on Fridays, what should we do with the roads if or no one travels to work?
Right.
Then how should we anticipate what we're designing?
I think the best way to characterize what I'm seeing across the country is that Oregon is exactly where they should be. With all the other states are calling and asking those exact questions. And do we know the answers? No, but thank goodness we're thinking about them, because they are going to change the way that we plan for transportation. So I think you're right at the right spot. As far as leaders are concerned, I would have to say that you're one of the leaders. So, because there's states that haven't asked those questions yet, that are just coming to the table.
And I was also wondering about who are the advisors to the governments. So who are the Jacobs in this area?
Well, there's no one else like us, though.
So do you do this work too? Or is this a related discipline that you're?
This is.
I'm sure. By the way, I'm sure that's right.
Yeah.
But you know, just expertise, because I think we're going to need to think through this with expert involvement.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like we're enjoying this morning.
Yeah.
This afternoon.
No, I'm joking. I'm being self-serving here, but there are certainly other consulting entities that have been getting into this area. McKinsey is an example. The Reach Foundation, RAND Corporation. So many are looking at a broad picture, implications from these emerging technologies. So there's plenty that are getting into this space and trying to understand the societal impacts that go beyond our engineering capabilities.
But you're also, your firm is looking at workforce patterns and travel patterns.
Absolutely.
Commuting,
Yeah.
et cetera.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you had been visiting my office on a Friday, clearly.
I think it's also worth mentioning that there's an NCHRP right now examining just the question you're talking about, and we can find the abstract for you at least on that.
Great.
Great.
So, Kristen, you want to come up and we'll talk about implications of all this?
As Kristen's putting that together, you guys are going to want this little handout that you had in your packet this morning, and we have a large outcomes map as she goes through it. And for those in the public, there were copies of this on the front table as well, so because it may get hard to see.
So I'm going to step into some of those planning questions you were asking about. So Brian's the engineer who knows everything, and I have been trying to learn about this stuff so we can answer the kinds of questions you were raising about what does it mean for the thinking we're doing in the future. So not about what's happening right now, not about the regulation, not about what we need to do in terms of what your autonomous vehicle task force is doing, but what do we need to do to make sure our plans aren't antiquated before they're done, right? That's the big question here. So that's why I'm talking about the next 20 to 30 years, and I invite you to think beyond that. But I'm going to come back with Jerry to the world we live in, which is this 20-year planning horizon, which I think has governed every aspect of my professional life. You are welcome to think beyond that. And really thinking about planning and investment decisions. How does understanding technology, so understanding the bright, shiny objects that are out there, how does it influence some of the decisions you're making now and the decisions you're going to be asked to make in the future, and those sitting in these chairs in 20 years, what are they going to say? Thanks for thinking about that. So we started this process of saying, how do we even frame this? Because this work is an emerging field as well, so you're asking who the leaders are. I think in terms of the people who are thinking about this, we're kind of all in the muddle together of figuring it out. There's not an established body of work in this area, so academics are very active in this area. Consulting firms are trying to be the smartest folks in the room. And your staff is also really in a leadership role, and I think ODOT has some of the most sophisticated DOT staff around these topics. So we started talking about foundational goals. So we looked at the OTP and the OHP and some of the emerging or the recently adopted modal plans and said, what are the kind of foundational goals for ODOT? And we said transportation options clearly matters, freight movement matters, reducing CO2 emissions and fuel efficiency matters, equity, transportation funding, managing our land use system, and then mobility and safety as being things that we think you care about. And at the beginning of any policy update or plan update, you would revisit these and make sure they're right, but they're kind of I think a reasonable touch point for moving forward. And then we said, gosh, how does this bundle of technology that we have been talking about, that Brian introduced to you, how do they affect these factors? How do they affect things that ODOT cares about? And so we said, all right, so what's the likely positive or negative impact? And because we're not sure, we have a series of lines that represent a range that we think these could have a positive or negative impact on. And the range, that length represents that range of possible outcomes. And it's important to note that this is without new policy intervention. And so what we want to kind of get you thinking about is where do you want to try to move that line or adjust the trajectory? And then we also said there are things that we don't understand, that certainty is low on. And so we said, how certain are we that we can get close to the right outcome, close to the likely outcome? And there are some things where we feel like we're pretty good. We're already seeing the writing on the wall from the technology. And there are places where we scratched our heads a little bit and said, I think this is what's going to happen, but I'm not really sure. And so we've got this uncertainty line. And then we really thought hard as a team, and we put a dot on these detailed lines, not the big picture one I'll show you, but some of the individual measures. And we said, here's what we think is likely to happen. We might be wrong, certainty, uncertainty. But here's what we think our existing policy might land us. And one of the big questions for you will be, not today, but to start thinking about where do you want to move those dots? Where does policy help you to get outcomes you want rather than outcomes you're likely to get with status quo? So we came up with this really beautiful rainbow-colored framework. And it's on that board. It's in front of you. And I'm going to walk through this kind of from top to bottom today. And feel free as we go to ask me questions. I'm not going to probably be able to answer most of them because a lot of it's kind of speculation at this point, but I can tell you what our thinking was. And then Jean's going to walk us through a discussion at the very end. But I think this can be, Jean and I have worked together long enough that we're comfortable being a little fluid. So if there's stuff you want to talk about as we go, stop us, and Jean will keep us on track. So the first thing we talked about was safety. And we think about safety. We're already seeing safety benefits from autonomous and connected vehicles. And that's in terms of some of us. I don't have one of them, but some people have cars that have some automation features already that help you to stay in your lane or warn you about stopping distances and help you with adaptive cruise control and all those sorts of things. So we're already seeing some benefits because they reduce that human error that often leads to crashes. I think one of the interesting things that Brian didn't mention today but has mentioned in the past is that you only need 15 to 30% of market penetration of connected autonomous vehicles to start seeing benefits for everyone. And so this is something where we have a pretty high level of certainty that safety will improve, and we think it'll be a positive outcome. So that's where that one landed. When we think about freight movement, this is another one Brian spent some time talking specifically about, but technology really has the potential to have huge benefits for freight mobility in the state. Platooning, data sharing, even CV technology that can help the freight industry respond to changes in weather and traffic and modify their trips and routes. These are things we're already seeing happen, and seems like it's likely to be very positive for the movement of freight in our state. We get to mobility. You get a very long line on the big map. And the reason you get a big, long line is because mobility is made up of several different things to think about. And this is one of the most complex things ODOT deals with. So it's also complex in this context. So we think about reliability, which is a big part of mobility, which is knowing how long it's going to take you to get to your destination. Technology has the potential to really improve reliability. And the reason comes back to safety. It's likely to reduce non-recurrent congestion. And so while my trip might take longer because it's more congested, at least it's the same amount of time every day because there's not an incident on the highway that's turned my 15-minute trip into a 45-minute trip. This is, in an autonomous world or with higher levels of automated vehicles and connected vehicles, I might not need to arrive in Silverton an hour before the meeting to make sure that I was here on time. Congestion is one where I think we're very unsure about the impact. As we move towards automated vehicles, as we move towards mobility as a service, are people going to choose to drive more, driving up congestion? Are we going to have vehicles driving around that have zero occupants as they're waiting for their drivers? Are we going to have a very efficient shared model? Unsure, and that really, it relates to VMT as well.
You know, and I want to just step in quickly. This is the section we want to make sure, again, as Kristen said, this is not an absolute. This was the team's best judgment, and it's not to be taken as an absolute. But want to make sure as we go through this, if you guys have questions or thoughts, raise them as we go. So, and we'll capture that.
Well,
Go ahead.
Kristen,
Yeah.
go back to the congestion point you just made.
Yeah.
And play with that one for a little bit, because I'm curious about what you have to say in terms of not certain about where that's going to go right now and why you believe that.
So I think what our team talked a lot about is it depends on so many things that affect our choices about how we get around. So if we see in our urban areas large numbers of people who are choosing a very inexpensive autonomous TNC ride, that could have one effect on congestion, and maybe it moves people away from active modes in transit. So that's one kind of future. Another future is that we have a shared fleet of autonomous vehicles, and they become very efficient. They're picking me up and my neighbor up and the guy down the street who all happen to work in the same part of downtown, or maybe a bunch of people in Silverton are getting in a shared autonomous vehicle and taking that ride to Salem together. And that becomes very efficient. But if they each own that autonomous vehicle and it's only carrying them, we could see more congestion on our roadways. So those are some of the possibilities, and I think it really, the interplay of the ownership model for autonomous vehicles matters, the effect it has on our transit system and how it affects the ability of people or the desire of people to take transit, and then our ability to provide transit matters, whether or not these things become great first last mile solutions and drive us all, those of us who live in urban areas, to a trunk line. I think those are all some of those things that are at play.
So then does it call the question of necessary policies that have to go into how that plays out? Because I would assume as time goes on and technology becomes even more efficient and the cost of vehicles become even cheaper and smaller and more efficient, people are going to be more inclined to wanting to get their own.
It's a industry-wide question right now. I think the other thing I didn't mention on congestion is the rate of adoption matters, because a lot of autonomous vehicles may be able to travel in the same space as fewer legacy vehicles. So there's also that question. So I think all really good questions, and ones that at least I don't feel like I have an answer to, and I haven't found anybody who feels like they can kind of give us a solid answer.
And when we were in California, we were also learning about curb utilization, because you have the drop-off of both the individuals as well as goods.
Yes.
So with more of that type of activity, there's a research paper that's being done in, I think it was University of Washington. I can't quite remember, but and I quite frankly had not contemplated curb utilization. But that is, from a land use planning and policy perspective, critical to also congestion of our streets and such.
And to piggyback on that, curb pricing, which we had a conversation about, which I'd never thought about before.
Jean is capturing all of these things because these are excellent questions and points. When we thought about transportation options, we wanted to make sure, coming to Commissioner Simpson, your question earlier about rural versus urban, I have a slide specifically on that topic at the very end, but we pulled those out separately because we think the potentials are different. So in urban areas, transportation options could increase. We could have more scooter share, more bike share, more car sharing, where all of a sudden my daily trip is a plethora of choices that work really well for me, and they could change on a day-to-day basis. We could also see a reduction in choices. So if everybody decides to buy an autonomous vehicle, maybe bike share is no longer viable, maybe scooter share is not viable anymore, maybe the bus that served my neighborhood forever isn't viable anymore. So in an urban area, that's one way of thinking about it. And you're going to notice the rural option extends farther into the positive and less into the negative. And that's because transportation options in rural areas aren't that good today. And so we don't expect they would erode a whole bunch. And the upside is there, but we put the dot here because it may not come to fruition, at least not as fast. So we could see the benefits of technology affecting urban areas first and fastest.
So just to verify, the dots are where we're at right now?
The dots are where we think things will head it's our best guess.
Without doing
Without
anything.
any policy changes. So the big question for you is, will be at some point, do you like where the dots are? And they were a team effort in putting them together. They're not, nobody's PhD dissertation resulted in that dot.
We're going to say something to that effect about 5 more times today.
Yeah, just lots of caveats. But for rural options, this really is a possible upshot. And if you think about suburban and exurban locations that we try to serve with transit and fixed route transit in particular. It doesn't work very well. There might be a real benefit here. And active transportation choices, again, that's another unknown about whether technology, mobility as a service, all of these things will drive people to take more active transportation trips, maybe on shared active transportation modes, or whether it becomes so easy and cheap to hop into an autonomous vehicle that riding your bike is only something you do for exercise. Answer's probably somewhere in between those two things. I want to talk about fuel efficiency, and I want to explain this one because it doesn't look very intuitive. And so fuel efficiency and reduction of CO2 emissions, all the stuff Brian talked about around electrification sound like they're really good for that, right? And they are. The question is, how fast does it happen, and what is the adoption timeline? How fast do people move into electric vehicles, and how does that correlate with and combine with other changes that are happening? So what's the net effect of maybe more VMT, electrification, which one's moving the needle in which direction the fastest? You have a potential for some conflicting outcomes, which is why it's on the little lower on the certainty, and there's a potential, probably not a real likely potential, but a potential that you could end up with a bunch more trips taken in non-electric vehicles and then driving this in the wrong direction. But I think more likely is to end up somewhere over here, and just a matter of when.
So when you're looking at fuel efficiency, are you looking at all vehicles? I mean, are you looking at electric buses? Are you looking at trucks? Or just just cars?
No, this really is thinking about the transportation system as a whole. We didn't get into talking about aircraft and that sort of thing, but kind of the things using our state highways. Transportation funding. I know this is something you all have talked a lot about fuel-efficient vehicles and what that means for transportation funding. So we've got a couple of factors here. We've got increases in fuel economy. We've got inflation. We've got declining federal revenues all playing in here. And I think the thing we did not assume full implementation of a robust user-pays system in where that dot is. If you get there, you could move that dot this way. Equity is a really important consideration, and equity is an important consideration because it is something that policy will have so much to say about. The market is going to do certain things, and you and folks like you at city council tables and county commission tables and DOTs all over the country will be having a lot of influence over who the benefits accrue to and over what time frame. Travel costs per mile are very likely to decrease as automation increases. This is what Brian was talking about. Mobility for the transportation disadvantaged is likely to improve, but that's not for everyone who's transportation disadvantaged, or we are defining as elderly, people who are living with disabilities otherwise who can't drive. So the benefits to some folks would be huge. The benefits to people who need help getting in and out of a vehicle may not be great. And that's another policy implication about how you maintain service for people who use lift vehicles and paratransit today. But there's an opportunity for improvement, but again, it really is a policy question. And access to jobs and education. As travel costs per mile go down, as we are better able to serve people in a wider variety of living contexts, we might be able to provide better access to a wider variety of jobs and education in the state.
Does mobility for transportation at disadvantaged include demographic shifts, as, for example, the baby boomer generation moves into latter stages of life and is more reliant on other kinds of, no longer able to drive, for example, or no longer able to drive at night? Did you take that into consideration?
Yeah, those are the people who probably stand to gain from, in terms of transportation disadvantage, are people who are able-bodied but choosing not to drive at certain times of day or in certain conditions. So an autonomous vehicle could be a huge, amazing benefit to those folks. So yeah, that's definitely part of that. The last one I want to touch on is land use management. And land use management is a really interesting topic, and it's something planners have spent a lot of time thinking about in this space. You'll talk to people who will tell you that technology is going to make our urban areas amazing, and it's going to drive people to live in cities, and it's going to reinforce land use patterns that urbanization, land use patterns, and settlement patterns that we've seen evolving over the last 100 years. And you'll have people tell you that this is going to mean that everybody is going to drive 2 hours to work every day to live in a bucolic location and no longer needs to live in a city. And we don't know the answer. What we do know is over the next 20 years, we're not likely to see huge changes in land use patterns because land use patterns take longer to change than 20 years. So we kind of get ourselves out of having to ask that very big question by thinking at a 20-year planning horizon. We also have the benefit of being in a state with very strong land use policy. And so the changes in Oregon may be different or less pronounced than an area that does not have strong land use policy. We think about rural areas in particular in the Oregon context, thinking about what's happening outside of our major metro areas is important. And I think about this from a kind of a curve of like Portland being over here and the most rural areas being here, and then a lot of Oregon falls somewhere in between. And so what we're likely to see is mobility services coming to rural areas more slowly than in urban areas. And if you think about TNCs as an example of that, so TNCs were first in Portland and then have gradually expanded to other parts of our state and our other metro areas, but are not serving rural areas. So you think about that same kind of curve for implementation of other technology. Rural and inner city transit is a challenge, and you guys the commission just looked at the Oregon Transportation Plan, so you've been thinking about these issues. It's going to probably continue to be a challenge in many parts of the state without major policy intervention. One of the real benefits to rural areas may be collecting data and understanding roadway conditions, both from an asset management point of view and a roadway operations and management kind of day-to-day point of view. So the rural areas may really benefit from that. So it's just 3 of the 20 things we could talk about in terms of urban and rural considerations. So that's what I wanted to share with you. I'm happy to answer questions, but I think more likely you're going to raise questions that don't have good answers, and that's why Jean's here.
Why? Because
we're going to document them. So
it makes me think, so today we had a tabletop exercise, and while we are to be thinking about the future, we also have an emergency preparedness role that we play in terms of resiliency. And on the horizon in that 50 years, if we're looking at what's next, we anticipate that the Cascadia will occur in our lifetime. And so are there areas that are looking, so if we're looking at cell towers and electric highways and different things, of course there will be significant disruption and catastrophic events that we're dealing with, so we can't plan entirely for that. But as we move to new technologies that are reliant on a system that we know fails in each of those types of activities and events, what type of a redundant, I don't know that if you're in the rural parts of the state, you want to give up a vehicle that runs off gas because you can, where is this, is that a consideration in this work? Or what should we be thinking about as one of the western states that will be affected by that? And our job is to be thinking about that occurring.
Resiliency. Brian, is there anything that's being done in this area that you want to talk about? Otherwise, I think it's a good one to capture.
Yeah, there is. We're talking about cybersecurity and systems resiliency. And as more and more of our transportation systems become reliant upon these vulnerable systems, there will definitely need to be policies that assure that there are redundant solutions to make sure that public safety is the top concern. So I think I'd be lying to say that all of the private industry that's behind the movement of these new technologies is all over it. I think there's still a lot to learn about the vulnerability of these systems, especially when we're talking about radio technology, right? It's becoming easier for rogue entities to get into access to these networks, and if we're relying upon them, there needs to be more resiliency built into them. So that is definitely a policy that should be part of any rollout of these technologies.
I think I'm going to go ahead and sit down too, so that
I'm heavily intrigued in the concept and notion of human settlement patterns, because I feel like that obviously dictates everything, the whole ecosystem in which we live in. And obviously none of it works without infrastructure and transportation network. And so I'm curious as we're going into deeper into all these concepts, and maybe it's not totally a question for Kristen, but not only those settlement patterns, but their consumption needs, which ties back to jobs and services and whether people work at the office or work from home. Are there groups or experts around internationally that focus on the notion of the future and anticipation of human settlement patterns? Because if we look at history, I mean, we started urban, Highway Act, went suburban, now it's going back urban. Is there going to be another shift back to suburban or rural? I mean, like, these are really important concepts to know, because if we're talking about we have, transportation funding insufficiencies, and we're talking about shifts in the future related to technology and obviously where humans want to be, we have to think about the future, the policies that we talk about today, and what policies are we talking about today that are going to impact those investments for the future based on those trends.
I'm glad that's not directly a question for me, so I'm going to let Jean capture that. But I think I think that one of the things to think about is about what you as a commission, what your kind of desired outcome is, and then what policies we can put into place that reinforce the kinds of outcomes we want. And I think we know a lot about that from what we've seen happen over the last 50 years. So we know the kinds of levers we can pull to influence people's decision making about how far and long they're willing to travel. And then we can ask questions about what we can do about it. And so I think it's a really important policy consideration. And Jerry wants to jump in, which I'm so grateful for.
Yeah, I have no answers either. But I think Adam talked a little bit about the scenario work that we see as part of phase 2. So that's where we're going to challenge you guys to help us think about what might be some likely, I guess, goalposts that could occur. Because I think with all the uncertainty here, the reason that scenario planning becomes so important is that what we're really going to end up doing is keeping track of signposts or mileposts to see what's actually happening. And then that's where you have to be more nimble with your policies and moving it more in a direction, or maybe alleviating some of the adverse things that are happening. But because of this uncertainty, that's why scenario planning, that's why the planning work that we're going to do is going to look so different, is that because of that, we're just going to have to be sort of see if we can identify the signals that will tell us what direction it's heading in, and then adjust accordingly, depending on what the desires are.
I just wanted to clarify something about my questions along the way when I was asking for thought leaders and leaders in the areas that you're touching on. I want to make clear that I recognize we have significant expertise and focus on this within the agency itself. And so my questions weren't intended to imply anything to the contrary. And I see external resources as augmenting internal resources. So I don't want anyone to misinterpret my questions as suggesting anything to the contrary, because they aren't. But I will say this, I do think these are very large issues and complicated and different, as Jerry just said, from maybe anything we've ever dealt with before, because technology and globalization and these forces are driving the world in a way that it's never been driven before. And so in that respect, I think we need to be as creative and think as broadly and leverage whatever resources we can reasonably leverage to try and answer what are a set of complicated questions and make good choices for the state.
Yeah, Madam Chair, just Commissioner Van Broekelen, as a matter of fact, I took your question as speaking to how this issue really focuses on the interrelationships that we have. And just the conversation today, we have sister agencies that can be around this conversation. We spoke to the land use issues. We've spoken to the economic issues. We've spoken to the energy type issues. Those folks will influence, and should that collective wisdom needs to be around the table, and we need to add to it. So the intent, I think, is pure, but it's spot on, that it's going to take all minds leveraging all bodies of knowledge to inform this, because everything touches everything in this discussion.
So I was just thinking about the problem of revenue reductions from all different agencies when we're talking about DMV to, I mean, safety is great. We're reducing the amount of crashes possibly using these vehicles, where we've talked about the shortage at the OSP as far as being able to find officers to patrol. I mean, some of these are win-wins, but I guess the question I have is, you're gonna look at the outcomes of the loss of revenue. And where I see this does really work in urban areas, knowing the rural areas that I deal with on a daily basis, this isn't gonna help them a lot, only because I look at the way either radio signals or using Wi-Fi, those kind of technologies, some of them are still on dial-up. So, you know, we're gonna have to look at that infrastructure. So when they were talking about the big lift of infrastructure just in vehicles, it's not just there. It's gonna be a really big lift of infrastructure to meet that demand.
And the continuity of being able to travel our state, because if we don't have that infrastructure available, it won't work. So, but it is an opportunity also to bring revenue and opportunity to the rural parts of the state that maybe haven't felt as benefited by some of these new technologies. We can't do it without them.
I just want to echo both comments, because I think, you know, we have to look at a system that works for the whole state. We're one state. We're the Oregon Transportation Commission. We have to take care of Oregon, and that means all of it.
Here. Brian, I think this one's for you. And it dovetails off what Commissioner Simpson just brought up. Oregon has, I think, the nation's first voluntary road usage charge program. You're probably familiar with it. As you're as I watched the kind of continuum of connectivity of cars, right now we have to kind of plug something into a car to be able to do that. Where do you think the threshold is, if you were to look into your crystal ball, when connected vehicles will be just up and running to do a road usage charge without having to put that GPS unit in their car? Speaking of transportation funding sufficiency and reliance on gas taxes.
Yeah, I'm very familiar with the state's insight into road user charging, and it's certainly the most advanced in the country in considering that as an option to the fuel tax. And we have, in the technology world, have often seen the capabilities of connected vehicle technology as a very as a means to implementing a road user charge system very easily. And at one time, it was thought that connected vehicles might be capable of tolling, allowing the implementation of a tolling solution. That didn't really take on so much. We're still at transponders, using transponders across the country. But in as much as that we can get acute information as to where a vehicle has driven at what time of day, through that basic safety message that I spoke of earlier, that tells you exactly where you were in the world at any given time. And when you grab that information, or you collect it yourself and submit that, that makes it fairly easy to monitor your road usage. So I think it's a gateway to helping to implement that system for sure.
And it's ready when?
Now.
Yeah.